G'day again, team. So today we must be looking at topic 2, which would be training and evaluation of physical performance, and in particular 2.1, chronic responses to aerobic and anaerobic training. Now, responses to training is a topic or a question that will come quite often in the exam. So for example, they might have a series of stats or graphs which they've had in previous years on sports. Some years it's been cricket, some years surfing, volleyball, netball. So they might have a table there of stats, ask you to pick fitness components, and then they might discuss how that could change as a result of aerobic training. That sort of extended response question. So it is a topic that gets covered a fair bit. So a very important one to understand. First thing we need to be aware of is there are two responses to exercise. There's acute responses and chronic responses. So firstly, acute. Acute are short-term or immediate responses to exercise. So we go from standing at the start line, gun goes bang, all of a sudden we have to run. So an acute response is something that happens immediately in the body, or it's just a short-term response. The example being there, increase of heart rate. Another example could be increased stroke volume or increased ventilation. So they're short-term, immediate responses to exercise. Whereas chronic responses are long-term. You might hear people talk about chronic pain, means long-term. Chronic fatigue syndrome is being fatigued over a long period of time. So chronic refers to a long period of time. Now, chronic changes in the body as a result of exercise are from repeated training sessions over a period of time. So the example there is the Biggest Loser picture. So these people are in the house for up to three, 4 months, and they are undertaking chronic responses. So they go through repeated training sessions and they experience long-term changes. Now, an example of a chronic response to exercise could be an increase in VO2 max, which all of us would undertake during pre-season. We come out not as fit as we probably should be. We go through repeated training sessions over a long period of time, usually 6 to 8 weeks. As a result, we would see an improvement in our VO2 max. That is a chronic response to training. So we've got short-term, long-term, acute, chronic. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at chronic responses, so in other words, long-term responses to anaerobic training. Now, anaerobic, what sort of activities are anaerobic? Anaerobic means without oxygen. So what sort of activities require without oxygen? So things like sprints, short explosive activities. So if we were to undertake a long-term training, chronic. Now remember, whenever I say chronic long-term training, I'm talking 6 to 8 weeks. So if we were to undertake a 6 to 8 week training program to try and improve our anaerobic, right, what would things that we'd be trying to do? We'd probably be doing things like weights, because we're doing strength and power training. By doing weights, we're going to increase our muscle size. Now, increasing in our muscle size is referred to as muscle hypertrophy. In other words, we've increased the cross-sectional size. Now, cross-sectional size simply means if I look at my bicep, if I was to take a knife and cut through the bicep and then stick a ruler in there and measure from the bone out, okay, I'd be able to measure the size. Increasing the cross-sectional size means, hey, it's simply going to get bigger. Right? So in terms of chronic responses for anaerobic training, the main change we would see would be muscle hypertrophy. Now, again, if you've got your little definition book, you might want to include this as well as acute responses and chronic responses. So muscle hypertrophy, an increase in the cross-sectional size of the muscle. So quite simply, we get bigger. And then there is muscle atrophy. Atrophy is a decrease in muscle mass. Now, atrophy can come as a result of not using it. Right? So it might be we go to the gym for 12 weeks, then all of a sudden we stop going. Right? After a period of time, we will start to see a bit of atrophy occur. We will lose some muscle mass. Another good example of muscle atrophy is if you've ever seen someone that's broken their arm and had it in a plaster. and they get it out of the plaster and there's one little stick arm and one big arm, it's because the muscles in that arm haven't been used. So hypertrophy is an increase, atrophy is a decrease. So again, we're looking at chronic responses, so long-term responses to anaerobic training. So we're probably doing a bit of strength and conditioning. And in particular looking at, well, how's that going to help the ATP-CP system? Well, what's the ATP-CP system all about? It's an anaerobic system. It's short, it's explosive. So if we're doing anaerobic training, it's probably going to directly help that. Both the system and the anaerobic training focus on strength and power, increase in muscle mass, muscle hypertrophy. So quite simply, if we undertook a long-term anaerobic training program, so things like weights, we would expect to get bigger. Therefore, we would expect to be able to generate more power in this first system. As our muscle gets bigger, we are able to recruit more motor units. Now, what motor units are, quite simply, is, if you like, the muscles that we can actually engage. So, as we get bigger, since we get bigger, our muscles get bigger, we can engage more motor units. So I think of, let's say I'm a scrawny little weakling, I want to try and pick up a heavy object. My brain might fire off as many motor units as it can. Let's say it can fire off 10. That's it. But as I get bigger, I'm able to generate more motor units. So I might be able to generate 15 of them. Okay? So as a result, I'm able to produce more force. ATP and CP stores are increased. Quite simply, if we've got a greater muscle mass, we've got greater area to store ATP. So we can actually store more ATP. Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? More ATP stored, that first energy system becomes even just a little bit more efficient, a little bit more powerful. So we've got more stores because we've got more muscle. Not because they've increased in concentration, just because, hey, as a result of this long-term anaerobic weights training, we've got bigger, we've got a larger muscle mass, therefore we can store more ATP. So this first system will become more powerful. We continue. We've got our long-term response to anaerobic training. And how's that going to help the lactic acid system? Well, again, bigger muscles means we've got more area to store glycogen. Glycogen is stored in the muscles and the liver. So if we've got an increase in muscle size, we've got an increase in glycogen stores. So what's the advantage of storing glycogen? Well, that can be converted into glucose. And when do we use glucose? We use glucose or carbs when we're working anaerobically. So if we're able to store more glycogen, which is converted into glucose, which we use in anaerobic systems, that would mean we can, work at a longer duration in the anaerobic system, which would suggest why we've got an increased lactic acid tolerance. So you think, example, 400 metres. 400 metres is largely reliant on the lactic acid system. If as a result of a 6 to 8 week training program, I've increased my glycogen stores, I'm actually going to be able to run that 400 metres faster because I've got more glycogen, which I need to work at an anaerobic level. I've got an increased tolerance to lactic acid. So what I'm able to do is actually run that 400 metres for a little bit faster. Whereas previously what probably would have happened is, since I didn't have as much glycogen stored, my body might go, oh, hang on, 300 metre mark, I'm really starting to battle. Whereas now I might be able to get round to the 350 metre mark before my body says, you know what, I'm battling. So that massive advantage all through just increasing our muscle size. So chronic responses to aerobic. So we're now looking at that third energy system, the aerobic system. So as a result of 6 to 8 weeks of aerobic training. So I've gone away, look at the subtle difference. That's anaerobic, which would mainly be weights. Aerobic training is probably going to be more your running. So if I'm going to do 6 to 8 weeks, which I have to get a chronic response, aerobic training, What is the greatest change I'm going to see? This top one, cardiac hypertrophy. Now cardiac means heart, hypertrophy, increase in muscle size. So I've increased the size of my heart, which is exactly what cardiac hypertrophy is. In particular, the left ventricle increases in size. So the left ventricle will become a little bit bigger. Now you think, well, what difference does that make? Well, if just that left ventricle becomes a little bit bigger, we can fit more blood in there each beat. The heart can pump out more blood each beat. If we can pump out more blood each beat, what does that actually mean? What is pumped around with blood? Answer being oxygen. So if we're actually pumping more blood out each beat, we're pumping more oxygen out each beat. That means more oxygen is getting to the working muscles and we can work at a higher intensity for longer. Okay? Other responses that we see: increase in blood volume, increase in mitochondria, lower blood pressure, increased myoglobin. Right, lower blood pressure is a good thing, no worries. Right? Increased myoglobin. Some of you might be sitting there scratching your heads going, what's myoglobin again? What's hemoglobin? What's heme? Heme is blood. So hemoglobin is what carries the oxygen in the blood. Myoglobin is what takes the oxygen out of the blood into the working muscles. So if we've got more myoglobin, we've got more things that's actually taking the oxygen out of the blood. So more hands ripping the oxygen out of the blood into the working muscles means that oxygen is getting into the working muscles quicker. Right? There's another one there where some of you might go, increased mitochondria. And you might go, hey, I'm not quite sure on that one. Here we are, another definition. Mitochondria, structures within the cells where ATP resynthesis occurs. The greater the number and size of mitochondria, the greater the fuels to produce ATP. Excuse me. So quite simply, mitochondria is where ATP is resynthesized. So remember our, excuse me again, remember our first energy system where we have ATP, flick off a phosphate molecule, it becomes ADP, add another phosphate on, ATP. So mitochondria is quite simply where that process will happen, the resynthesis occurs. So if we go back here, increased mitochondria. So in other words, if we've got more mitochondria, what does that mean? It means that this process of resynthesis can probably happen quicker. So if we can resynthesize ATP quicker, what does that mean? It means we're probably going to recover quicker. Hey, massive bonus. The quicker we can recover, the sooner we can go again. So, these we've already had. Chronic responses to aerobic, cardiac hypertrophy. All right. Increased left ventricle size, increase in blood volume, increased mitochondria. Cool. Chronic adaptations. We've already spoken about this lots in this presentation. 6 to 8 weeks. So if we are talking chronic training adaptations, we are talking 6 to 8 weeks. We'd also be looking at 3 sessions a week. Right? So you look at your pre-season, hey, chances are you're probably going to be doing 2, maybe 3. Use it or lose it. So quite simply, fitness. We will have fitness and we will keep fitness until we stop doing fitness, and then we will lose it. Now all of us know that because we play a particular sport, and when the season finishes, what's the first thing we do? Is nothing. Because we're sick of training, we're over it all, and we do nothing. And we might do nothing for 2 weeks, and then we might get involved in PE, or just a little fun activity, or we might go for a run, and then we go, oh geez, where did that fitness go? Right? So we do actually lose it. It's called detraining. You know? Some lose it quicker than others. There are just those people that for whatever reason they're able to hold on to it a lot better. Generally they are people that have probably done training more often. Your body's almost got a bit of a memory to it where it goes, hang on, I remember how to be fit. And if you've always had that sort of fitness aspect, you won't lose it as quick. Adaptations occur at system and tissue level, cardiovascular, respiratory, muscles. Okay, so our body is going to adapt at all levels to training. But the key for chronic adaptations to occur must be over that 6 to 8 week period. Generally, about 3 sessions a week. Okay, keep that in mind. So, chronic adaptations to the cardiorespiratory. Cardio, heart, respiratory, lungs. So cardiorespiratory adaptations are about delivering oxygen to the working muscles more efficiently. Makes sense. So the more efficient we can be, the better off it's going to be for our performance. So we spoke about cardiac hypertrophy, enlargement of the heart, particularly the left ventricle. So, remember, as it appears in the body. So left ventricle down here. So what's going to happen is we're actually able to get more blood in there. It's going to be a bigger area, so we can get more blood, more oxygen. Right? More oxygen, work at a higher intensity for longer. That's the big thing. So capillarization is an increase in the capillary density and blood flow to skeletal or cardiac muscle as a result of aerobic training. So capillaries, quite simply, become more dense. More dense generally means more stronger. More stronger means, hey, we can probably pump blood a bit better. Right? So we're getting blood around the body. So all these changes, right, come back to one simple thing. We want to get more blood around the body. We get more blood around the body each beat. That means we get more oxygen. That's what it comes down to. Oxygen is our big currency. So all these changes are about getting more blood around the body to get more oxygen. Capillarization, as we spoke about, increased blood flow, increased oxygen flow. That's what it's all about. So chronic adaptations again. So we're looking at what are other long-term changes in the body as a result of this aerobic training. Increased stroke volume. Well, this makes sense, doesn't it? If we've got a greater left ventricle size, in other words, the heart is a little bit bigger as a result of cardiac hypertrophy, it means we're going to be able to pump more blood out. Go back through your little definitions book, have a look, see what stroke volume means, pumping blood out. Right? So if the heart's become bigger, quite simply it's going to be logical that the increase in stroke volume because we're able to pump more blood out. So, chronic adaptations. Lower resting heart rate. We've spoken in previous slides about a lower resting heart rate is generally associated with healthier or fitter athletes. All right? Reason for that being, we are able to pump more blood out with each beat. Okay? That's what it is. So, trained or untrained, approximately 5 litres of blood is circulating around the body. So we've got about 5 litres of blood. Cardiac output is Q, which equals stroke volume times heart rate. So, before training, our stroke volume was 70 mils per beat. So in other words, we were pumping out 70 mils of blood per beat. After training, we're actually able to pump out 100 mils. Now, if we want to get the same value, this heart's going to have to beat 71 times per minute, whereas this one's only going to have to beat 50 times to get that 5 litres per minute going around the body. All right? Simple maths. All right? So in other words, since we are pumping more out each beat, our heart is going, you know what, I can pump 100 mils per beat. I've only got to beat 50 times. Whereas previously your heart was going, I'm battling to get 70 out each time. I'm actually going to have to beat more often to get the same value. So at rest, or sub-max activity, our heart rate will be lower. So that's why we generally associate a lower heart rate with fitter athletes. You can see the difference there, 20 odd beats. Okay, at max it's going to be different. At max it's going to be different because our max heart rate won't change, 220 minus your age. So both of these would be 202, 202, but the difference is here. So at max we are able to get more blood and oxygen around. Trained athletes have lower heart rates at sub-max, we just spoke about that. Trained athletes will recover quicker. Reason they will recover quicker, hey, the heart rate's not having to beat as high. If the heart's not beating as high, it's probably working aerobically and we can recover much quicker from aerobic activity. Chronic adaptations, increased atake VO2 diffs. That's our arteriovenous difference. Trained athletes absorb more oxygen into the muscles. Right? Why? Because that increased myoglobin that we spoke about a few slides back. Not only is there more oxygen floating around the body when we become fitter as a result of our chronic adaptations, there's more oxygen because there's more blood, but there's more myoglobin taking that oxygen out of the bloodstream into the muscles. Right. So we start putting this big picture together. We've got more blood each beat because of cardiac hypertrophy, which means we've got more oxygen. We've got more myoglobin taking that oxygen into the muscles. We've got more mitochondria, which resynthesizes ATP. So we've got all these great things happening as a result of a 6 to 8 week training program. And this is probably why we do pre-season, so that we are fit. So VO2 will increase. Your VO2 will increase anywhere up to about 30%. Right? And we know this. This is now the science behind why we feel better after pre-season. We feel fitter because we've gone through all these changes. Now, will increase as a result of increased cardiac output, increased red blood cells, increased myoglobin, increased atake VO2 diff. So there's more blood and oxygen going around and our body is more efficient at using it. Lactic threshold, also called OBLA, onset of blood lactate accumulation. All right? This will increase as a result of chronic training. What's the advantage of this? So remember, lactic threshold or OBLA is the point where lactic acid builds up greater than it can be removed, or the point where your body has to change from working aerobically to anaerobic. So what's the advantage of raising our lactic threshold? Right? You can work at a much higher intensity without using anaerobic glycolysis. Now anaerobic is without, glycolysis is breaking down glycogen. So that is the lactic acid system. So in other words, if your lactic threshold was 85% of your heart rate max, that means once you hit 86, you would be working anaerobically. You'd be working the lactic acid system. And we know the lactic acid system can only go for about 2 to 3 minutes. So, if we raise our lactic threshold to 90% of our heart rate, what does that mean? It means we can work aerobically right up till we get to about 91%. So as it suggests, we can work at a much higher intensity. Okay, muscle tissue adaptations to aerobic training. High reps resistance training is going to get us results, and the results we're going to see is going to be an increase in mitochondria, increase in myoglobin, increased fuel stores, and a decrease in the reliance on the lactic acid system. All right? So all these wonderful good things that we've spoken about previously. Increased fuel stores. In other words, muscle size increase, we've got more place to store glycogen, we've spoken about this. Increased ability of the muscles to oxidize both glucose and fats. Burning fats as a fuel source is a good thing. If we can burn fats as a fuel source, right, that means we rely less on glycogen. Ideally, our body wants to burn fats, and if we can do that, we rely less on glycogen, we burn fats, and then we can what they term glycogen spare, where we spare our glycogen for probably the last, if you like, 800 metres where we can sprint home. So glycogen sparing can come about as a result of burning fats. So that's 2.1 team. As always, we'll go over this in class, we'll go into greater details and we'll always have some questions for you, but that should give you a good starting point. Until next time, thanks team.